It's like the world gone crazy this morning. Trump's performance was beyond belief. Good evening, everyone. That quote is from a senior European diplomat talking to CNN about the NATO summit in Brussels and what the president said there today. Now, this diplomat, we should point out, is not alone. The Western allies have been talking about it. The Russians have been talking about it. The world is, and tonight so will we. Yet, as shocking as it may be to our allies, as troubling as it is to some American lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, it should not be surprising whether voters at the time gave it much credence. What happened today in Brussels is what Donald J. Trump campaigned on. He said he was going to do this. It's the distilled essence of what he has believed, in fact, for years. The problem is the beliefs he campaigned on and tweeted about and stirred up crowds with on the stump, they do not happen to be based in fact. And the concern is he either does not know or does not care to know. Or worse, that he does know better but chooses instead to disregard the facts to make some larger point. Now, just to be clear, you can believe a 70-year-old military alliance against Soviet and now Russian expansion is a good idea or not. You can agree or disagree with the central premise of it, that an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all. You can take issue with any number of aspects of NATO, and later in the program we'll talk to someone who does just that. However, the president's main grievance, which he expressed today at a summit breakfast, simply is not factual.
Many countries are not paying what they should, and frankly, many countries owe us a tremendous amount of money for many years back, where they're delinquent, as far as I'm concerned, because the United States has had to pay for them.
The president's suggestion is that NATO is a dues-paying organization, that members chip into some pot for collective defense, that they don't pay their fair share. They haven't been for years, and they owe the U.S. money. Now, keep it honest, as you'll see, that is simply not the case. It's not the way it works. It's not even close. It is, however, the way President Trump believes it works, and he said so for years.
Number one, NATO is obsolete.
And number two, the people aren't paying their way.
It's obsolete, and we pay too much money.
NATO, we're going to have the people that aren't paying, they're going to start paying.
It's obsolete. We're getting ripped in NATO. They don't pay their bills.
They are delinquent.
So, as you see, he campaigned on the notion. He was elected on it. He's tweeted about it throughout the presidency, including on the flight over, saying many countries in NATO, which we are expected to defend, are not only short of their current commitment of 2%, which is low, but are also delinquent for many years in payments that have not been made. Will they reimburse the U.S.? Now, keep it honest, there is nothing to reimburse beyond a token amount to keep the lights on in Brussels. Each member nation pays nothing for collective defense. Zero. Members have their own defense budgets and have agreed to spend 2% of GDP on defense by the year 2024. Now, as you can see from estimated 2018 numbers, some have already hit the target, some have not. And yes, the United States does spend far more than any other NATO country. And yes, past American presidents, including the most recent one, have criticized NATO members for not spending enough on defense. Past presidents have referred to burden sharing, even used words like contributing. They have not, however, said or suggested that other NATO countries owe the United States money, let alone back payments, which, again, these two countries do not. And other presidents have openly recognized that NATO member nations contribute to the forward bases that allow the U.S. to be a global military superpower. Also, that many sent soldiers who died for us in Afghanistan after 9/11 because the NATO treaty, Article 5, calls for just that. In any case, the president believes they're freeloading. And today, he demanded member nations not only meet the 2% goal immediately, he told them to double the target to 4% of GDP, an amount even the U.S. doesn't spend. He also singled out Germany for additional criticism.
But Germany, as far as I'm concerned, is captive to Russia because it's getting so much of its energy from Russia. We have to talk about the billions and billions of dollars that's being paid to the country that we're supposed to be protecting you against.
The president expanded on that in a tweet, explicitly connecting or conflating the idea of defending Europe with getting paid. Quote, "What good is NATO?" he writes, "if Germany is paying Russia billions of dollars for gas and energy. Why are there only 5 out of 29 countries that have met their commitment? The U.S. is paying for Europe's protection, then loses billions on trade, must pay 2% of GDP immediately, not by 2025. Again, this may be shocking to some or even to many. It's not, however, a surprise. The president campaigned on much of this. But now that he's acting on it, even some leading Republicans are speaking up, albeit in fairly gentle ways. Yesterday, 97 Senate Republicans, Democrats, and independents passed a non-binding resolution in support of NATO, which for 7 decades hasn't been especially controversial. Today, the outgoing chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee weighed in.
I believe that America's leadership around the world has made the world safer for Americans and made the world a better place. And when I see that leadership diminishing and us trying to break apart alliances that we created, it troubles me.
Troubles him. Unclear, though, if it also troubles President Trump. That, however, is unclear. The president's next stop is the UK tomorrow morning. British Prime Minister Theresa May tonight saying, and I'm quoting here, "There is no stronger alliance than that of our special relationship with the U.S." And just a short time ago, the president tweeted again, summarizing the day. "Billions of additional dollars are being spent by NATO countries since my visit last year at my request, but it isn't nearly enough. U.S. spends too much. Europe's borders are bad. Pipeline dollars to Russia are not acceptable." More now on the president's trip and his day today from CNN's Jim Acosta, who joins us now from Brussels. So this refrain from the president about NATO, it isn't new, as we've talked about. He's been saying it for years. Should anyone, especially NATO members, be surprised?
Well, Anderson, I think they are surprised to some extent, and they've been concerned about this for some time. This has been the fear, that the president would come to NATO and bash longstanding U.S. allies right before a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So that is a surprise that he would come out this hard, this heavy at this NATO summit right before meeting with Vladimir Putin. Anderson, the other thing that was a surprise to some of the members of NATO here in Brussels was this call from the president to boost defense spending among the NATO partners to 4% of GDP. They said, they have been saying, and you mentioned this just a few moments ago, that they wanted to get to 2% of their each member's GDP by 2024. 4% is obviously a pretty big load for some of these countries. It's been a burden that has been shouldered by the U.S. for some time. But Anderson, beyond that, what is a concern to diplomats in the European community, and I talked to some of them, some of our colleagues have been talking to them, is that the president seems to have a pattern, and that is he goes to summits, he goes to events around the world, and he bashes his allies in Europe and around the world and seems to be cozying up to dictators and undemocratic leaders like Vladimir Putin. That is a big concern to European leaders and other NATO members here, and that is surprising.
Also, his comments about Germany basically being under the thumb of Russia are fascinating. I mean, it's so, for a president who's been accused of being under the thumb of Russia, for him to lob that specific criticism at Germany is, it's either brilliant or fascinating or disturbing, I guess, depending on how you look at it.
Absolutely. It sounds like the president is engaging in whataboutism instead of responding to criticism that he's too cozy with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He is saying, well, what about Germany being dependent on Russian gas and fuel? The fact is, Anderson, and you know this, most people know this who have followed this, the Germans have been buying Russian fuel dating back to the early 2000s, predating Vladimir Putin's aggressive stance on the world stage. And so the president is bringing this up in sort of a misleading way. What we do know is that while the president brought this accusation up in front of the NATO Secretary General earlier today, saying that Germany was somehow being held captive by Russia, he did not say this publicly in front of the cameras when he was sitting alongside Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. He didn't say it alongside the French President Emmanuel Macron. This topic was brought up with both of those leaders when the president was sitting down with both of those leaders, and he declined to really engage with those leaders on that particular issue. So the president seems to want to throw his weight around on the world stage and engage in some pretty fiery rhetoric, but when he had a chance to do it in front of those two world leaders, he didn't choose to do so. So, Anderson, I think the question that a lot of European leaders, a lot of U.S. allies are leaving this summit with is how serious the president is about this bluster, but it does make them concerned about the mindset he is taking into that meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, because there are so many very big, important issues on the line when he meets with Vladimir Putin coming up in Finland on Monday. Anderson.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see a world leader be, tough everywhere except when they're face to face with the actual person that they are being critical of.
That's right.
It's an interesting strategy. Jim Acosta, appreciate it. Thanks very much. Obviously, the president goes to London. Will be in London tomorrow. Joining us now is author and retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters. Lieutenant Colonel Peters, first of all, the president's claims about payments to NATO, what do you think it is? A willful mischaracterization, a gross misunderstanding of how it actually works? What is it?
Well, I think in the beginning it was a misunderstanding that he jumped on, but now it's a technique to throw red meat to his base. Trump thrives on disruption. And the irony, Anderson, is although we pay over 3% of our GDP, about 3.2 to 3.3% for defense, if you broke it out, given our commitments around the world, far less than 2% goes to NATO, is in support of NATO. We're in the Pacific, we're in the war against terror, we're in space. So on so many levels, the claim is false. But beyond the sound and fury, what matters is that NATO is a bargain for the United States. It's cheaper than war, and it is the most successful peacetime alliance in history. It has made allies of European states that fought each other for centuries, right up to 1945. It's helped us, it gives us bases. And so Trump's attacks on NATO, I think it's partly he doesn't want to backtrack and admit he was wrong, but also with Trump, virtually every trail for me leads to the Kremlin.
And you're saying this leads to the Kremlin in what way?
In the sense that Trump is, for whatever reason, and I have my own suspicions certainly, Trump is both enamored and fearful of Vladimir Putin. I mean, if you look at his pattern, he is afraid to say anything critical of Vladimir Putin. It's another issue, but to me, I just think the Russians have the goods on this guy, and that's the only explanation I can come up with. But in the meantime, we are faced with real damage, real immediate and perhaps some irreparable damage to this greatest of alliances, NATO. And it was fascinating to me today to watch Jens Stoltenberg and Angela Merkel and Macron dealing with Trump. It was like watching psychiatrists patiently deal with a disturbed child. I mean, Trump, my God, I mean, he's not only shaming our nation, he's doing real damage to our security, to our interests, and to our allies. And Vladimir Putin could not be happier.
You know, one of the things that's often said about President Trump is that he attacks people on the very things that he's been attacked on or been criticized for. You know, talking about Russia, talking about Germany being captive to Russia, the irony of that is kind of extraordinary.
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because one thing Trump is indisputably brilliant at is propaganda. He knows how to control the media. We're talking about him right now. We talk about him virtually every day on the air. And his genius is, you know, using traditional propagandistic techniques where when you are backed into a corner over an issue, you lash out and accuse your enemy or your foe of the same issues. The way he accused, when he's backed in the corner in Russia, he accuses Hillary Clinton of making an uranium deal, which was really peripheral. Now he's backed into the corner over this upcoming summit with Putin. And what does he do? He lashes out at Germany. He says, oh, the Germans, they're worse than us. They're controlled by Russia. Well, first of all, the Nord Stream pipeline under the Baltic is a strategic concern that Angela Merkel inherited from Gerhard Schroeder, a previous chancellor, who was, in fact, Germany's Donald Trump, and she's doing her best to deal with it. But Angela Merkel has been the greatest chancellor Germany's had since Konrad Adenauer in the early post-war years. She's the last man standing in Europe. She has held the alliance together against Putin. She's held the sanctions together. And naturally, I mean, Trump dislikes her because she's a plain middle-aged woman who talks back to him. And Putin hates her because she's a plain middle-aged woman who talks back to him and imposes sanctions on him. And she is an admirable leader. God knows I wish we had a leader like that ourselves. For all the mistakes she's made, she has been a brilliant chancellor, and we have a fool for a president, a malevolent fool.